All right, today we are looking at neoclassicism. This is a movement in Europe in art and architecture, late 18th and early 19th centuries. So now we're getting the 1800s, and we're getting closer and closer to this modern art that you all will enjoy. Neoclassicism evolved through a desire to recreate the heroic spirit of the art of Greece and Rome. The scientific interest in opposition to the Rococo style that was driven by a desire to restore ancient Rome values within society. After this lesson, you're going to be able to connect the continued rejection of Rococo with the resurrection of classical thought during neoclassicism in art and in architecture. Examine how the betrayal of morality, virtue, and heroism is defined, in neoclassical art. And so, neo meaning new, classical meaning old. So it was a revival of that old. Um, Jacques Louis David, 1748 to 1825, followed the spirit of the Enlightenment. He believed art should highlight what is moral, virtuous, and heroic. In David's Oath of Horace, he depicts pre-republican Roman legend of the Horace triplets. According to tradition, Rome and her nearby rival cities Alba decided to settle their differences by choosing three champions from each city. The Romans sent the Horace triplets, and Alba sent the Carati, also triplets. One sister was Heredy's sister was engaged to one of the Carati, and one of the Heredy brothers was married to a Carati sister. Um, and so David's painting depicts a moment at which the Heredi swear on their swords held by their father to win, while the writer distressed women of the family. The theme of heroic self-sacrifice and love of country, taken from Roman history, a clear and forceful composition, and statuesque figural forms all characterize the neoclassical era. And again, looking at that heroic, the stance, the way that they are kind of in these very dramatic poses. The work was commissioned by royal patronage, but was used by the French revolutionaries to inspire to sacrifice, or as inspiration to sacrifice themselves for the good of the nation. And so, very heroic. The Death of Marat. This was always one of my very favorite paintings. This was David's French Revolution-inspired work. The Death of Marat represents the assassinated revolutionary radical and personal friend of the artist Jean-Paul Marat. Marat is seen to the viewer just after he was stabbed by Charlotte Corday, who was a member of the rival revolutionary group. The revolutionary martyr is depicted in his medical bath, as he was often confined due to his chronic skin disease, which he contracted from the sewers of Paris while hiding from the royal police. In his hand, he holds a note from Corday, in which the murderess was able to gain access to Marat. The character's neoclassical fashion, the composition is clear and forceful. David also creates the atmosphere that is at the same time sympathetic. Marat's confinement to the bath. Southern the primary through the massive void in the upper portion of the painting, and enraging as man's trust and vulnerability are obviously betrayed. And so he's in this moment of can't defend himself in the bathroom, and she has stabbed him. The knife, I believe, is here on the floor. In his hand, still the pen where he had been writing letters, and then a letter that explains, oh, just how awful things have been. After the fall of Jacobins, the Revolutionary Party, which David was a member, and the execution of their leader, Robespierre, I'm butchering those names, the artist was tried and imprisoned for treason. Upon his release, Napoleon Bonaparte, who had come to power precisely because of revolutionary fractionalism, offered David the position of first painter of the empire, and he quickly accepted. Again, dramatic fashion. Look at the enormity of the compositions, and still kind of going back to some of that sort of um, vertical or some of the angular, if you will, composition. Napoleon commissioned a commemoration of his coronation in 1804, which took place in the Cathedral of Notre Dame in Paris. The monumental work is over 30 feet long, 20 feet high, and contains over 100 figures. The newly consecrated emperor is crowning his wife Josephine, while Pope Pius VII, seated directly behind Napoleon, gives him his blessing. The neoclassical style of the artist is evident in the clarity of each of the figures are individualized. Again, no two figures are the same. Everyone has their own little expressions and so forth. The structure, note how the religious figures are placed to the right, and the governmental figures organized to the left, with Napoleon strategically between them. The Paris Pantheon, of course, we're reflecting back to that Greek and Roman architecture. Later 18th century architects embraced neoclassicism over the theatrical and often ostentatious designs of the Baroque and Rococo. Remember Baroque and Rococo? They had all that extra stuff going on, tons of stuff to look at. There are lots of ornamental sculptures adorned every aspect of it. The columns were often adorned with extra imagery. But here we have kind of a back to the basics. One of the first buildings to truly reflect this neoclassicism was the Pantheon in Paris, designed by Jacques-Germain Soufflot. The lines are clear and smooth. The ornamentation is sparse. The walls are blank except for the modest garland decoration. The Roman temple facade, Corinthian capitals, and colonnaded dome on the central plan design all represent the renewed interest in that ancient Roman design. The Madeleine was begun in 1764. Construction was halted due to the French Revolution. That'll put a hold on some things. Napoleon later charged Pierre Vignon, 1763-1828, to convert the church into a temple of glory to memorialize the French victories under his command after Napoleon's death, and the structure reverted back to a church. The temple is the peripheral of the Roman Corinthian order, with columns well over 60 feet high, a high podium, central staircase, and deep porch. I'm going to return to the pediment here. We got all the typical columns in it. Looks very much like what came right out of ancient Greece. Neoclassicist sculptor Antonio Canova carved many portraits of Napoleon and his family. The portrait of Napoleon Bonaparte Bourges, I'm guessing that one. The sister of Napoleon is portrayed as Venus, the goddess of love. The artist had originally suggested executing her portrait as a version of goddess Diana, but Pauline insisted on Venus, giving some credence to her scandalous reputation. The grace, polish, and purity of the line characterized both neoclassicism and the artist's style. And again, if we look, this is very reminiscent of that. Even that pre-Hellenistic Greek and Roman art, where we see there is that move to the naturalism, but we don't see like all the age lines and all those hyper realistic and naturalization we saw in Hellenistic and thereafter. Neoclassicism in England and the United States. The neoclassical emphasis on rationality, civic pride, and love of country, which is so meaningful in the Revolutionary France, was just as popular in revolutionary America. When it came to architecture, statesman and scholar Thomas Jefferson, you probably heard of him, pushed to have neoclassicism adopted as official architectural style of the United States. So if you look at all of our government buildings, you'll see columns and pediments and domes and all kinds of fun stuff like that. Jefferson's fondness for the neoclassical style is evident in the design for Monticello, his home in Charlottesville, Virginia. You can see there's a pediment, there's columns, there's a dome, all very neoclassical. The influence of Palladio is combined with the use of wood instead of marble and brick, which are distinctly American elements. Again, so instead of this being all that gray concrete, it's made of wood and brick. And so it's a mixture of that classical design and that new materials. As fitting as neoclassicism was for American architecture of the period, it was not popular in sculpture, seen in the portrait of George Washington by Horatio Greenhouse. Not a very popular way of depicting Washington. The realistic rendition of Washington's head on an idealized body was inspired by a lost Phidian sculpture of Zeus. And so the presentation was too much for American taste and sensibilities of the period, and the work was never displayed. In fact, one senator wanted to throw it into Potomac, and probably for good reason. That there's nothing right about that. From neoclassicism to romanticism. Romanticism grew out of the neoclassical period, fostered by three artists who were pupils of David: Antoine Gingras, Anne-Louise Giraudet Trizon, and Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. And I'm telling you, I butchered all those names. Antonio Gingras, like his master, painted several works at the bequest of Napoleon. Napoleon obviously responsible for most of the art that we see that remains today. In Napoleon at the Pest House in Jaffa, Gross records the effects of the plague that broke out during the Napoleon campaign in the Near East in 1799 devastated both the French and the Turkish troops. And again, think about these paintings as documentary paintings, historical paintings, and not just artistic expression, but they are telling a story, specifically these historical events. Napoleon is fearlessly risking contagion and comforting his afflicted men who've been confined to a mosque at Jaffa. The polarity and the lighting that the scene of the Turks shrouded in shadows. To the left, the French bathed in light. To the light recalled David. And again, if we look at the lighting and we consider how this is reflective of where they were with that understanding of that pre sort of chiaroscuro effects what we got with those Dutch masters. We're back to that basic understanding of light and dark and that emphasis of use of perspective to tell that space. Ross's uses of exotic setting, the contemporary rather than classical hero, and presentations of extreme emotion, suffering, and death are breaks with the characteristics of neoclassicism and become standard in the Romantic period. Guiraud de Trizon, known for the pre-Romantic sensibilities. The burial of Atala is the scene of popular contemporary novel, The Genius of Christianity, by Chateaubriand. The story is about a monk, Father Aubrey, who helps a Native American youth bury his love. Having sworn to remain a virgin, preferred to poison herself rather than succumb to the lust of Shatas. And so, typical story. We've heard about families who have family members in love with one another. That the families are at odds with each other. Montague and Romeo and Juliet. I'm at a blank for what the other name was. In any event, it's a common story. Characteristic of the Romantic period, there are exotic people, Native Americans in exotic settings, the wilderness of Louisiana. Scene is also replete with primitivism, passion, and tragedy, also romantic characteristics. The organization, lighting, and sculptural figural forms of this composition are still very neoclassical. Think about how this composition relates to some of the compositions where think of her as Christ. How many paintings do we see as someone holding or pulling Christ along in this almost exact same sort of composition? Ingres was more committed to neoclassical styles than David, but the conservative would have significant influence on the liberal art Romantic period, such as the works of La Grande Odalisque. Ironically, Ingres' most influential famous paintings were those featuring the exotic and the erotic, such as La Grande Odalisque. The term Odalisque refers to a member of the Turkish harem, which in itself is exotic and erotic. The artist's debt to Italian mannerism is evident in the elongated body proportions, smallish head, and the Odalisque combined with grace, elegance, and color scheme of the composition. So, neoclassical doesn't always have to refer all the way back to Greek and Roman. This just harkens back to mannerism, which, as you recall, was that horrible, awful time period where they had the long feet and long hands. You see her hands are extra long, smaller heads, elongated necks, and often twists in the body that didn't quite make sense with people who have bones in them. And so, neoclassical, new but old. And so, looking at those older art forms and how they were brought into a modern era, there is an assignment that you will be looking at. I believe it's at the end of the next one. We're looking at Romanticism as a term used to describe the art movement in the late 18th and early 19th century, roughly 1750 to 1850. And we looked a little bit last week when we were looking at some of those large, huge aerial perspective paintings being done in Europe and how Americans were approaching that in the Hudson Valley School, or Hudson River School artists, and how they did those big sort of paintings around the same sort of time. Primarily a reaction to the reason and strict forms and rules of neoclassicism, the style emphasizes the emotional, the mystical, and the spiritual over the reasonable and the rational. After completing this lesson, you're going to be able to understand the stylistic transition from neoclassicism, reason, and classical ideals to romanticism's emotional and spiritual conquering of the rational, address how art represents and reflects culture it was created within, and utilize art knowledge to analyze how content ideas are communicated in a work of art. Fuseli Romanticism incorporated interest in morbidity and the occult. In The Nightmare by Henry Fuseli, this depicts a woman who essentially draped over bed, sleeping as an incubus ominously perches over her, a demon who sexually preyed on sleeping women. A ghostly horse with piercing eyes, known as Mara, waits in the shadows. Mara is a spirit who suffocated victims in their sleep. The composition is a departure from the intellectual and rational forms of neoclassicism. Think about emotionally what kind of response would a person have to that. Francisco Jose de Goya rejected neoclassicism and claimed that his only inspirations were nature, Velasquez, and Rembrandt. Goya received a considerable amount of recognition early in his life and was named painter to the king at the age of 20. This is the family of Charles IV, clearly influenced by Velasquez's La Meninas. Remember that painting where even though the king and queen were simply reflections of mirrors, they were still the central portion. Now, he does not play with the composition quite the same way that Velasquez did, but Goya painted himself into the composition on the left, much like Velasquez did in his painting. Different from Velasquez's use of darker values for your brushwork and formal, more dramatic presentation. Remember Velasquez, it was as if the people were still getting ready for the portrait, as if they weren't really sitting yet. The candid naturalistic presentations and individual psychological depth is speculated to be an unflattering reveal of the mockery of the sitters of this piece. It's a testament to the artist's skill. The shootings of 3rd of May of 1808, again, when we think about art as documentary, historical in nature, this is a historical documentation of the dissatisfaction of the Spanish people with the king, Charles IV, who looked to his son Ferdinand VII in hopes that the prince would institute certain reforms. Ferdinand VII enlisted Napoleon's help in overthrowing his father, but once Charles IV was removed from power, Napoleon replaced his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte placed his own brother on the Spanish throne. This led to the rise of the Spanish people against the French troops as invaders. The French retaliated mercilessly, and Goya's depiction of the well-armed and ruthless French troops slaughter unarmed, terrified Spanish peasants as anti-heroes. The emotional, dramatic scene is heightened by the stage-like lighting, the Christ-like poses of the central peasant, and the gore of those murdered earlier. Goya painted his scene to warn men never to do this again. And Saturn devouring his children. This is just, again, when we think about the mystical, the unnatural, supernatural. Goya's later years were spoiled by declining health, increasing isolation and pessimism. His later works reflected this, were extremely dark and gruesome. Goya's troubled state of mind is evident in a series of frescoes called the Black Paintings, which were painted on the walls of this farmhouse for his own viewing. Saturn devouring his children is a brutal and gory depiction of the god Saturn eating his children. This is based on the prophecy of that predicted Saturn, Greek name Coronis, would be overthrown as king of the universe by one of his own children, which the god sought to prevent by eating his own offspring. You can actually, if you get a chance, go into this module and check out the various paintings that he has available here. They're remarkable. It's a neat kind of walk through his works of art. Géricault was a classically trained but rejected neoclassical forms. He rejected those neoclassical forms. And in this painting called Insane Woman, typical romanticism fascination with abnormal states of mind, Géricault intensely studied the mad and deranged visiting both mental asylums and prisons. This represents the suffering of the woman in this portrait, which tight lips, red, vacant eyes, furrowed brow, but also the intense, frightening, you feel it tangible, how just kind of disturbed she is. In the Raft of Medusa, we've got a lot going on here. The action again, you look at the vertical or the diagonal sort of composition. Jericho represents a few remaining survivors desperately trying to flag down a ship in the distance, which can barely be seen on the horizon to the right. The horrific drama of the incredible suffering, despair, and death are indeed intensified by the twisting mass of bodies and purposeful placement of the figures. The X shape of the composition, you have the sort of the diagonal here and another diagonal here. Um, with the corpses from the going up to the right, and then from the left we have the pyramid figures, the upper right. That kind of heightens that emotional impact. You see the raft and the corpses are kind of tossed back and forth, and you kind of get that back and forth that creates this sort of very dramatic composition. Liberty Leading the People, one of the most famous paintings of Delacroix. His paintings are dramatic, emotional, and visually complex. He was also a supreme colorist and drew inspiration from the current events of the day. So look at the color here. We can compare it to the way that Rembrandt, Michelangelo, how their use of color was very similar. And Liberty Leading the People is subject to 3 days of July 1830, known as the Troy Gloriouses. I don't know what that was, how to pronounce that, which saw the autocracy of Charles X and brought in Louis Philippe's parliamentary monarchy. As a liberal and romanticist, the artist wanted to celebrate the July uprising when Parisians took up arms in hope of restoring the Republic. At the center is the allegorical figure of Liberty, dramatically waving the tricolor flag and storming the corpse-ridden barricades with young combatant at her side. Reviled by conservatives, the work was bought by Louis Philippe in 1831 and soon hidden to prevent the provoking public unrest. Lion hunting in Morocco. In 1832, Delacroix journeyed to Morocco and lived there for 6 months, creating sketches he would use over the next 30 years. Many of these involve the theme of man versus beast. The lion hunting in Morocco furthered development as a colorist is seen again, looking at his use of color and how this very background would be reminiscent of what we might see in Leonardo da Vinci's work, kind of harkening back to that more classical use of color. After Morocco, the artist's sense of expressive power and color was heightened tremendously and would impact the artist later half of the 19th century, such as the Impressionists. Turner, and again, Turner's one of the is romantic with Romanticism in England and the United States recoiled at the effects of the Industrial Revolution. He was perceived to be a direct opposition to all that was natural. This led to the emotional landscape painting, the dominant genre of the day. An English romantic painter, Joseph Turner, lamented the effects of industrialization with energy and motion of it in its composition. So we're looking here again. Gone are those sword and hardened lines that were going to explain to us the depth through single point perspective, and replaced with that is this sort of emotional response to what he sees going on in his scene. Turner, like his French contemporary Delacroix, drew inspiration from recent historical events seen in the slave ship. This depicts the 1783 incident where a slave ship captain, upon learning his insurance company would only cover slaves lost at sea and not those who died along the voyage, had the sick and dying slaves thrown into the sea. In this painting, Turner has matched the brutality of the event with the turbulence of the sea, the energy of the brushstrokes, and the intensity of the color. And again, this is sort of the beginning of this understanding of painterly type of painting, where we are kind of getting away from the dry representational works of art, and now moving more into the impression that is created by the light and by the movement of the ocean in this case. The sharpness of color of the power of the brushstrokes carry the emotional force, equality with the identifiable forms in this work. Turner would have a tremendous impact on the development of modern art, leading ultimately to 20th century abstract art, where forms are eliminated altogether. So again, he's gotten rid of those kind of hard and fast forms. We don't see that linear perspective being emphasized. When we look at Cole and Bierstadt, Cole work the oxbow depicts the bending of the gentle Connecticut River. Again, this is kind of going into those reflective of those Hudson River paintings we looked at last week. Landscape painting serves an allegory which typical American landscapers painted. The right, the painting shows a cultivated landscape, while the left is untamed wilderness. Allegorical representation of the United States in the early mid-19th century, as most of the country was still being explored and revealed. Bierstadt also painted landscapes that served as allegory, and among the Sierra Nevada mountains, California, there's a variety of terrain, snow-capped higher mountains that mingle with the majestic clouds and rays of light, rugged lower mountains, strewn waterfalls, the dense, lush forest, and smooth, clear lake. All this creates for a very nice composition, and again, amazing use of light. And if we think back about how this sort of reflective of some of that, even though this isn't neoclassical, it's reflective of that classical artwork. Is we think about the works of Michelangelo, the Rococo period, even where we see these verticality of these paintings being created by this space that almost goes on forever, going up or sometimes even going down into a space. Romantic era architecture, Romanticism in architecture is eclectic and defined by the goal of establish a mood through architecture, a goal to establish a mood. The 19th century saw the revival of Gothic architecture, which scholars believe rose out of an opposition to the Industrial Revolution. So, industrial everything was kind of square and utilitarian. What we see now is going to this. Remember, in the medieval period, in this Gothic architecture, we had those flying buttresses and that sort of interesting ornamentation that kind of came along with those sculptural aspects being added to that initial sort of Greek and Roman, if you will. Tall spires and things like that. This is the Houses of Parliament. These traits are neo-Gothic, Houses of Parliament in London, which replaced the earlier structures that were destroyed by fire in 1834. The plan of the complex, designed by neoclassicist architect Charles Barry, is symmetrical and regular, but the exterior, conceived by A.W. Pugin, is all Gothic. The asymmetrical placements of the towers and Big Ben you see there is on the right, and the linearity, which recall that English perpendicular style. Oh. Let's look at the Royal Pavilion. My apologies. The romantic taste of the exotic surfaced in the Royal Pavilion of John Nash. Again, it's a sort of reminiscent more of that Islamic architecture structure served as a royal pleasure palace of the English sea resort of Brighton. The exterior is clearly inspired by Islamic architecture of India, which is English possession at the time. Interior is just exotic, showing the Greek, Egyptian, and Chinese art influences that flow throughout. Again, if we think of this, we can kind of reflect back to Taj Mahal, kind of reminiscent of that. Whoops, and I still keep clicking the wrong button. Last but not least is the Opera de Paris. The Baroque also made a bit of a comeback during the Romantic period as architects sought to establish a mood of opulence and grandeur through the ornate and sculptural style. The Neo-Baroque is evident in the Paris Opera House by Charles Garnier. Note the lavish ornamentation. Again, when we think about Baroque, we think about all the we talk about Baroque architecture, we talk about Baroque sculpture because they had all that extra stuff going on. The ornamentation, undulating movement, and sculptural quality of the facade is what makes it neo-Baroque. The Paris Opera House has classical inspirations as well, those granite columns, cornices, and arches, as well as Renaissance influences, the tripart elevation, and the paired columns. So, lots of stuff coming back into vogue. And you are going to do an assignment, and the assignment is to do a short reflective writing discussion based in preparation for a discussion-based assessment. And the assignment, let me see if it has it here. Yes. Select one work of art from the lesson, anywhere of the past two little, neoclassicism and romanticism. Identify the stylistic element characteristic of the Baroque period specifically, and explain how this technique supported the artist's visual depiction of a story within the artwork. Yeah. So choose any work of art from the lesson. Identify the stylistic characteristics that make it Baroque, and explain how the technique supported the artist's visual depiction of a story within the artwork. Good luck with that one. All right, guys. Thank you so much for playing along. Have a great day.